Martha was an elderly black woman who lived in a quiet, friendly neighborhood. She had lived there for over 30 years, and everyone knew her. People respected her for her kind heart and wise advice. Martha was the type of person who would always stop to help others, whether it was carrying groceries for a neighbor or offering a listening ear. Her soft smile made everyone feel safe around her, and her house was always full of laughter. One sunny afternoon, Martha decided to take a short walk to the local market. It was a habit of hers, a peaceful moment she enjoyed every week. The air was warm, and the streets were lively with people enjoying their day. Martha walked slowly, taking in the sights, her cane tapping gently on the sidewalk. She had no idea that today would be different. As she passed a small alley, a loud roar of a motorcycle engine caught her attention. She turned to see a man speeding down the road on a heavy, black bike. His name was Jake, and he was a notorious biker known for his quick temper and bad reputation. He was tall, with a rough appearance and tattoos that covered his arms. His face was hardened, as though he was always ready for a fight. Martha had seen him before, but she never had much reason to pay attention to him. That was about to change. Jake pulled up beside her, the engine of his bike roaring loudly. Martha glanced over, startled by the sudden noise. He stared at her for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he slowed down to a stop. His hands gripped the handles of the bike tightly, and his face looked angry, though it was unclear why. "Watch where you're walking, old woman," Jake shouted, his voice loud and rough. He was just looking for a reason to start trouble. Martha, surprised by his words, took a step back. She was used to people acting impatient in the busy city, but she had never been spoken to like that before. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get in your way," Martha replied calmly, trying to de-escalate the situation. She knew how to stay calm in tense moments, and she hoped that her soft words would help him see reason. But Jake wasn't interested in calming down. He scoffed, revving the engine of his motorcycle and stepping closer to her. "You better watch out next time, or I might just knock you out of my way," he growled, the threat hanging in the air. Martha felt a shiver run down her spine. She had no intention of starting a fight, but she wasn't afraid. She had lived a long life and seen many things, good and bad. Yet something about Jake's anger made her feel uneasy. She could tell he wasn't someone who cared about consequences. "Please, just go on your way," Martha said, her voice steady but firm. She took another step back, trying to keep space between them. Jake's eyes flickered with irritation, but before Martha could say anything more, he took one final step toward her, raising his hand. She wasn't sure what was coming next, but her heart raced in her chest. Little did she know that the situation was about to escalate into something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Martha's heart was racing, but she kept her calm. She had lived through many tough situations in her life and knew that staying composed was the best way to handle trouble. She could see that Jake was getting angrier by the second. His eyes were filled with frustration, and his body language was tense, like a dog ready to bark. "Don't think you can just walk away from this," Jake shouted, his voice now even louder. He took another step closer, his boots hitting the ground with each angry stride. Martha felt the tension rising in the air. She knew she had to be careful. "I'm not looking for trouble, young man," Martha said, her voice still calm. "I was just trying to go about my day." Jake laughed harshly, the sound echoing around them. "You think I care about your day?" He sneered. "You need to learn some respect. Old woman like you, thinking you can walk around like everything's fine." Martha wasn't sure what was going through his mind, but she knew he wasn't acting like someone in control. His words were getting harsher, and his hands were shaking with anger. She could see the muscles in his arms tense up, and it was clear he wasn't just talking anymore. He was preparing for something. She stepped back a little, hoping that would give him the space he needed to calm down. "Please," Martha said gently, "there's no need to make a scene. Everyone has their troubles, but we can always walk away from them." But Jake didn't seem to hear her. He was too caught up in his own anger. His eyes narrowed, and he suddenly pushed his bike forward, blocking Martha's path. She stopped in her tracks, trying to think of what to do next. The street was still busy with people, but no one seemed to be stopping to help. They just watched from a distance, unsure whether to get involved or not. Martha felt a wave of unease wash over her. She had been in tough situations before, but something about Jake felt different. His aggression was almost like a storm, unpredictable and wild. And it wasn't just the words anymore. It was the way he was acting. She could tell he was getting ready to do something he would regret. "Get out of my way," Jake yelled, stepping forward with a sudden move. Before Martha could react, he raised his fist, his face twisted with rage. His fist flew through the air in an instant, and before Martha knew it, the world around her seemed to tilt. The next thing she felt was a sharp pain, and everything went black. Martha felt everything go black. Her body went limp as she crumpled to the ground, the sharp pain in her head quickly fading into nothing. It was as if the world around her had stopped, and she was trapped in a quiet, dark place. The last thing she remembered was Jake's fist flying toward her, his face twisted in anger. It all happened so fast, and now she couldn't even feel the pavement beneath her. People who had been standing nearby rushed forward, some shouting, others calling for help. A young woman knelt by Martha's side, gently tapping her cheek. "Are you okay, ma'am? Can you hear me?" But Martha didn't respond. Her body was still, and her breathing was shallow. The woman looked around, panic rising in her chest. "Someone call an ambulance," she cried out. Jake the biker stood just a few feet away, watching with wide eyes. He had never intended for things to go this far. At first, it had been about showing Martha he wasn't to be ignored. But now, seeing her lying unconscious on the ground, his stomach twisted with a sense of guilt. But instead of feeling remorse, he was still angry. Angry at how quickly things had spiraled out of control. "Get away from her," someone shouted, and Jake quickly turned to see a man walking toward him. The man's eyes were full of disbelief and anger. "Is she okay?" the man asked, his voice shaking. He looked down at Martha, but his focus never left Jake. There was a serious, almost dangerous look in his eyes. Jake just stared at him, unsure of what to say. He hadn't meant to hurt anyone. It had been a mistake, just a punch to show who was in charge. But now it seemed like a lot more than that. The crowd had grown larger, and a few people were starting to take pictures with their phones. Jake felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. He didn't want to be the center of attention, and he certainly didn't want to be seen as a man who would hurt an elderly woman like that. But his pride was still standing in the way of any apology. "Someone get the cops," another person said. As Martha remained unconscious, Jake could hear the rising tension in the crowd, and he knew it was only a matter of time before someone would do something. He stepped back, not sure whether to run or stay. His mind raced, thinking of how he could get out of this mess. But as he turned to leave, he was stopped by a calm voice behind him. "Stay right where you are," a man said. Jake turned to see a tall, well-built man with a stern face walking toward him. The man's eyes seemed to pierce right through him. Jake felt something in his gut twist at the sight of him. "You're not going anywhere," the man said firmly. It was then that Jake realized this man wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid of him. He didn't seem to care about the biker's reputation or his anger. He was focused on something much more important, making sure Martha was okay. Derek had been spending the afternoon at home, relaxing in his small apartment. He had just finished a workout when his phone rang. It was from a neighbor, and Derek immediately sensed that something was wrong. "Martha's been hurt," the neighbor said in a shaky voice. "You need to get here now." The words hit Derek like a punch to the stomach. Martha, his mother, was the most important person in his life. She had raised him with love, taught him the value of kindness, and always supported him, no matter what. The thought of something happening to her filled him with a cold sense of urgency. Derek was an off-duty Navy SEAL, but that didn't change the fact that he was just a son worried about his mother. He grabbed his jacket and rushed out of his apartment. His mind raced with thoughts of what could have happened. Had someone broken into her house? Was she in danger? His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the street where she lived. The drive to Martha's neighborhood felt like it took forever. Derek's training made him think quickly, but there was no preparing for the anxiety he felt in that moment. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as he navigated the busy streets. He couldn't shake the image of his mother, hurt and alone. When Derek finally arrived at the scene, he could see a crowd gathered around Martha's body. An ambulance was parked nearby, but it wasn't moving. His heart sank, and he rushed toward the group of people, pushing his way through the crowd. He needed to get to her. Martha was lying on the ground, surrounded by strangers. A young woman was kneeling by her side, her face filled with concern. Martha's eyes were closed, and she wasn't moving. The sight hit Derek like a ton of bricks. "Mom!" Derek shouted, his voice filled with panic. He knelt down beside her and gently touched her face. Her skin was cold, but she was still breathing. Thank goodness. He exhaled a sigh of relief, but his mind was already racing again. Who did this to her? Why? As he checked on Martha, he noticed the biker, Jake, standing a few feet away. Jake had an uneasy look on his face, like he was trying to avoid eye contact. Derek could see that Jake wasn't acting like a person who was sorry for what he had done. Instead, Jake seemed worried about something else, maybe about the trouble he was about to get into. Derek stood up and locked eyes with the biker. There was no mistaking it. Jake was the one who had hurt his mother. "You," Derek said, his voice calm but filled with anger. Jake looked up at him, and for a moment, Derek saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. But Jake quickly regained his bravado and crossed his arms, trying to act tough. "You did this to her?" Derek asked again, his voice steady. He wasn't shouting, but his words carried weight. The whole crowd seemed to go silent, waiting for Jake's response. Jake didn't say anything. He just looked at Derek, sizing him up, clearly trying to decide whether to fight back or back down. But Derek wasn't interested in a fight. His focus was on one thing, making sure his mother was okay. Derek didn't take his eyes off Jake. Every muscle in his body was tense, and his mind was focused. He had dealt with dangerous situations before, but this wasn't about combat training or tactics. This was about his mother, the woman who had always been there for him. No one was going to hurt her and get away with it. Jake could feel the weight of Derek's stare, but he didn't back down. Instead, he stood up straighter, trying to act confident, even though Derek was much taller and seemed far more dangerous. The biker's fingers drummed nervously on his motorcycle's handlebar, a sign that he was feeling the pressure. "You really think you can just come here and start trouble?" Derek said, his voice firm but calm. "What kind of man hurts an elderly woman?" Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. He could tell that Derek wasn't just another angry person looking to fight. This was someone who was in complete control of himself, and that made Jake feel uneasy. He had been in fights before, but something told him this was not a battle he could win. "I didn't mean to," Jake began, but Derek cut him off, his tone sharp. "Don't try to make excuses," Derek said, his voice growing colder. "You hurt my mother, and now you're going to answer for it." Jake shifted uncomfortably. The crowd around them had started to whisper, and Derek could tell they were all waiting to see what would happen next. He wasn't sure if the biker was going to apologize or try to run, but Derek was ready for anything. The moment felt like it stretched on forever. Derek's hand was steady at his side, but inside, he was filled with a controlled fury. He wasn't going to let this man get away with what he had done, and he wasn't going to let anyone think for a second that this was okay. Then, Jake took a small step back. "Look, man, I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice shaky now. "It was just a mistake. I didn't want to hurt her." Derek took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Jake's face. "A mistake? You hit her. You knocked her down. What kind of mistake is that?" Jake's face reddened with frustration. He was used to getting away with things. He was used to intimidating people and walking away without any consequences. But with Derek, things were different. Derek wasn't backing down, and he wasn't intimidated by the biker's size or attitude. For a moment, Jake seemed like he was about to say something else, but then he looked around at the crowd. Their eyes were all on him, and he realized that he was no longer the one in control. The anger and bravado that had driven him earlier seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of fear he wasn't used to. Derek took another step closer, his voice steady but powerful. "You've hurt someone important to me, and now you'll face the consequences. Don't think you can just walk away from this." Jake swallowed hard, realizing that there was nothing he could do to escape the situation. He was facing a man who was calm, powerful, and willing to protect what mattered most. Derek wasn't the type to throw punches recklessly, but his presence alone was enough to show Jake that this fight was already over. The air around them was thick with tension. Derek stood firmly in front of Jake, his eyes never leaving the biker's face. The crowd had grown silent, sensing that something big was about to happen. Derek wasn't shouting, but his presence was strong enough to make anyone pay attention. Jake, on the other hand, was clearly shaken. His bravado from earlier had all but vanished. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to figure out how to handle this situation. He had never met someone like Derek before, someone who wasn't intimidated by him, who wasn't afraid to stand their ground. "You've got a lot of nerve, man," Jake muttered, though it was clear he was just trying to keep up the act. He tried to look tough, but the fear in his eyes was hard to hide. "I don't want any more trouble, all right. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Derek shook his head. "It doesn't work like that. You don't get to hurt someone and then just say sorry. You hurt my mother, and now you have to face the consequences." Derek's voice was calm, but each word felt like a hammer hitting the air. Jake took another step back, his eyes darting to the crowd around them. They were watching him closely, waiting to see what he would do next. It was clear that he was starting to feel the pressure. "I said I didn't mean it," Jake repeated, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, okay? Just let me go. I'll get out of here, and you won't have to deal with me anymore." Derek didn't budge. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice steady. "You don't just get to walk away after what you did." For a brief moment, Jake looked like he was considering his options. He wasn't a fighter by nature, and he had no idea who Derek was or what he was capable of. All he knew was that he had pushed the wrong person today. Derek stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The crowd remained still, watching intently. They were all waiting for Jake to make his next move, to see if he would try to fight or if he would back down. Jake finally raised his hands in a defensive gesture, looking defeated. "I don't want to fight you, man. I was just having a bad day." Derek let out a deep breath, his muscles relaxed but still ready for anything. "This isn't about a bad day. You chose to hurt someone. You need to own up to that." His voice remained calm, but there was a firmness in his words that couldn't be ignored. Jake lowered his hands slowly, his shoulders sagging. It was clear that he wasn't going to fight Derek. The biker had finally realized that he was no match for someone like Derek, someone with calm strength and unshakable resolve. "You're lucky I'm not looking to make this worse," Derek said. "But don't think you can just get away with it. You'll be dealing with the police soon enough." Jake said nothing. He knew there was no way out now. He had already crossed a line, and the consequences were clear. He looked down at the ground, his head lowered in shame, knowing that his actions had caught up with him. Derek turned to the crowd, his voice clear. "Someone call the police. This needs to be handled properly." As the crowd slowly began to move, Derek stayed by his mother's side, keeping a watchful eye on Jake, who remained in place, unsure of what would happen next. The police arrived not long after Derek had called for them. Their sirens pierced the air, cutting through the tense silence that had settled over the crowd. Jake's head was still down, and he stood motionless, as if waiting for the inevitable. Derek never took his eyes off him, making sure the biker didn't try anything else. A police officer stepped forward, her eyes scanning the scene. She looked at Derek, then at Jake, and finally at Martha, who was still being carefully examined by medical staff. The officer raised an eyebrow, noticing the seriousness of the situation. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Derek stepped forward, ready to explain. "This man," he gestured to Jake, "hurt my mother. He punched her for no reason, knocked her down, and left her unconscious on the sidewalk." The officer nodded, listening carefully. "And you are?" she asked, looking at Derek. "I'm her son," Derek replied, his voice steady. "And I'm not going anywhere until I know she's okay." The officer turned her attention to Jake. "Is this true?" she asked. Jake didn't respond immediately. He avoided eye contact, his face flushed with shame. "I didn't mean to. It was just a mistake," Jake muttered, but his voice was weak. It was clear that he knew he couldn't get away with his actions anymore. The officer crossed her arms. "A mistake doesn't cause someone to end up unconscious on the ground. Do you have any reason for what you did?" she asked sharply. Jake looked around, trying to find a way out, but everyone was watching him, waiting for an answer. He swallowed hard before speaking again. "I was angry. I've been having a tough time lately." The officer didn't seem convinced. "Anger doesn't give you the right to hurt someone. You need to take responsibility for your actions." Jake's shoulders slumped as he realized there was no escape. The crowd had seen it all, and there was no way to hide what had happened. Derek stood tall, his posture strong, but he didn't let his anger take over. He knew the best thing he could do now was to make sure his mother got the help she needed. The paramedics had already started working on Martha. They had her on a stretcher, and though she was still unconscious, they'd reassured Derek that she would be okay. They were going to take her to the hospital for further checks, just to be safe. Derek followed the ambulance, but he didn't take his eyes off Jake. The officer had already put him in handcuffs, and he was being led to the police car. Jake still hadn't said much else, and it was clear that he knew the consequences of his actions had arrived. Derek climbed into the ambulance with Martha, staying close to her side. His mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had it escalated so quickly? How had Jake thought he could get away with such violence? He held his mother's hand gently, thankful that she was still breathing, even though she was unconscious. He whispered softly to her, "You're going to be fine, Mom. Just hang in there." The ride to the hospital was quiet. Derek sat there, his mind still processing everything. He wasn't sure what would happen next with Jake, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never let anyone hurt his mother again. The hospital was a quiet place, filled with the soft hum of machines and the steady movement of doctors and nurses. Derek sat beside his mother's bed, watching her closely. She was still unconscious, but the doctors had assured him that she was stable. They had run tests, checked for any serious injuries, and now all he could do was wait for her to wake up. He held her hand gently, rubbing it softly as he tried to comfort her without words. He had never felt so helpless in his life. The world seemed to slow down around him, as if time itself was holding its breath. His mind kept replaying the scene, the punch, the way she had fallen to the ground, and the fear that had gripped him when he saw her lying there, not moving. But now she was here, safe, and for that, he was thankful. As the hours passed, Derek refused to leave her side. He knew that if she woke up and saw him there, it would bring her comfort. He didn't want her to feel alone, not after everything that had happened. He was her son, and he would always be there to protect her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Martha stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and then slowly her eyes opened. The bright hospital lights made her squint for a moment, but as her vision cleared, she saw Derek sitting next to her. Her face softened, and a faint smile appeared. "Derek?" she whispered, her voice weak but filled with relief. "What happened? Where am I?" Derek's heart ached as he looked at her. "You're at the hospital, Mom," he said softly. "You were hurt, but you're okay now. They've checked you out. You're safe." Martha blinked, still trying to piece things together. I remember the man. He punched me, didn't he?" Derek nodded, his expression serious but calm. "Yes, he did. But you don't need to worry about him anymore. The police are taking care of it." Martha sighed and closed her eyes for a moment, processing everything. "I'm sorry, Derek. I never wanted to cause you trouble. You've been through so much already." Derek shook his head, brushing a strand of hair away from her forehead. "Mom, don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong. You've never caused me trouble. I'm just glad you're okay." She looked at him, a faint glimmer of concern still in her eyes. "But what about the man? What happened to him?" Derek paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. He didn't want to go into too much detail, especially not when she had just woken up, but he knew she deserved to know the truth. "He's been arrested, Mom. He's facing consequences for what he did." Martha nodded slowly. She seemed to be understanding, but Derek could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. "I'm just glad you were there, Derek," she whispered. "You saved me. I don't know what I would have done without you." Derek smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You don't have to worry about that, Mom. I'll always be here for you. No one is going to hurt you again." As they sat there together, the noise of the hospital faded into the background. It was just the two of them. And in that moment, everything felt right again. The danger had passed, and Martha was going to recover. Derek had kept his promise to protect her, and nothing could change that. For the first time since the incident, Derek allowed himself to relax a little. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for now, he had his mother by his side, safe and sound. And that was all that mattered. Days passed, and Martha's recovery was slow but steady. She had a few bruises on her face and some aches in her body, but nothing serious. The doctors were pleased with her progress, and soon she was able to leave the hospital and return home. Derek stayed by her side the entire time, making sure she had everything she needed. As they sat together in her cozy living room, Martha looked at Derek with a thoughtful expression. "I can't believe how quickly everything changed," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "One moment, I was just walking to the market, and the next, I was lying on the ground, not knowing what would happen." Derek sat beside her, his eyes full of understanding. He had been through a lot of emotions since the incident: anger, fear, relief. But now, as they sat together, there was a sense of calm. The worst had passed, and Martha was safe. That was all that mattered. "You're stronger than you know, Mom," Derek said, his voice filled with affection. "You didn't let it break you. You stayed strong, even when things looked bad." Martha smiled faintly. "I don't know about that. I was scared, Derek. But you came for me. You always do." Derek nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I'll always be here for you. No matter what happens, I'll protect you. That's what family is for." They sat in silence for a while, enjoying the peacefulness of the moment. The past week had been a whirlwind of emotions, and now it felt good to just be in each other's company, without the constant worry and fear. Derek knew that the experience had changed him in some ways. It had reminded him of what really mattered: family, love, and the strength to stand up for those you care about. Later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Derek stood up, walking over to answer it. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see one of the officers who had been at the scene of the incident. "Mr. Derek, how's your mother doing?" the officer asked with a kind smile. "She's doing well, thank you," Derek replied, stepping aside to let the officer in. "What brings you here?" The officer glanced around the room before speaking. "I just wanted to let you know that the situation with Jake has been handled. He's been charged, and the court will decide his punishment. But I wanted to thank you personally. Your quick thinking and level-headed actions helped make sure everything stayed under control." We could tell that you weren't just doing this for yourself. You were protecting your mother. It made a big difference." Derek nodded, feeling a sense of pride, but also a quiet humility. He wasn't looking for recognition. He had simply done what anyone would have done for the people they loved. But hearing the officer's words meant something. It was a reminder that his actions had made a real impact. "Thank you," Derek said sincerely. "But it wasn't just me. My mom's a strong woman. We've been through a lot, but we've always had each other's backs." The officer smiled. "You're right. Family is everything." As the officer left, Derek closed the door and turned to his mother, who had been listening quietly from the living room. "We made it through this together," he said, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "And that's all that matters." Martha nodded, her eyes filled with love and pride. "Yes, we did. And we always will." The story ended with a sense of peace and resolution. Martha and Derek had weathered the storm together, and their bond had only grown stronger. They knew that life would always have its challenges, but as long as they had each other, they could face anything. And that was enough.